Hello, everyone, and welcome to Delightful Dissent. So today it's episode 71, and I'm with Kieran Morris, who is an Enneagram-led voice coach and professional musician. So thank you very much for joining us on the show. Yeah, it's great to have you here. Um, Today's assumption that we're going to be talking about is the right thing to say. And this is a really interesting one. I think I've spent a lot of time agonizing over with what I should say, what I've said, and when I thought it was wrong. Um, and it really is an idea that gets in the way of um, really of what I want to say. I think that search. So I think it's a really interesting thing to be speaking to today. Um, really looking forward to exploring this some more. And yeah, so if you happen to be new to Delightful Descent, it's a shared exploration of something that people really kind of take for granted, that that doesn't get out there as much as it could. And it's an idea that came from my work, really talking to people who are taking pioneering approaches to complex and difficult problems. And Kieran is absolutely one of these people. So I'm really happy to have him on the show. And I found that you often hit these hidden barriers, these implicit beliefs, these deep assumptions. And it's a show about challenging those. So I hope the show gives you specific ideas that can help you in your personal and professional life. But perhaps more importantly, I hope it can give you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge assumptions of your own. Because I'd like this to be something that everyone does. That's completely normal. And the show is Delightful Dissent because, yeah, we might be disagreeing with prevailing opinion a little bit, but it's about not just changing our minds, but exploring and playing and looking at different possibilities and just different ways of seeing things. And the show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. There may be, be aware that there may be the possibility of strong language, and we may be discussing some difficult and serious topics. In this particular show, I think the most likely topics to come up are misunderstandings and interpersonal conflict that can arise from those, communication difficulties in general, and perhaps some broader stuff about self-worth and self-trust. So if any of those are any issue for you, then please just know that that's a possibility. And there aren't any perfect answers here. This is about exploring, it's about asking questions of yourself and of others, and really just finding out. And so please do ask us live if you're watching the live stream. Add a comment and we'll bring that in. If you're listening to or watching the recording, we'll be sharing details about how you can get in touch with us at the end of the show. So Kieran, I think we first met through the Happy Startup School, didn't we? And I've been wanting to get you on the show for a long time. So it's taken a while to get you, and so I'm really pleased to have you here. And partly because I've in our conversations, and particularly in our planning conversation for this, I was really struck with this very clear, compassionate approach to self-expression, and I think that's such a wonderful thing to be able to share. But could I ask you to maybe introduce yourself a little bit, and a bit about you and the kind of work that you do, please?
Certainly. Thank you, firstly, so much for having me, Matthew, and for the invitation. And I'd just like to reflect back the how you exemplify this compassionate space holding so beautifully, and I love that introduction. So thank you. So yes, we met probably about a year ago now when I first joined Soul Cafe. I think my first event in Happy Startup School, and it's something that appealed to me very much through the work that I do to speaking from this compassionate space of self-expression. The work that I do broadly falls into two quite separate camps. I have my professional musician persona, which means that I run a couple of community choirs in Berkshire, and I run a very good chamber choir with UCL students, an audition chamber choir. So there's a really interesting difference in terms of the approaches there, from one which is completely open, inclusive, community-led, and one which is auditioned and an expectation of sight reading, pitching, really coming in at quite a high sort of level. And holding both of those spaces in my musical world is a real privilege, actually. So that comes about from my training as a classically trained tenor. So I trained at the Guildhall and at Sussex. So I think we've both got a Sussex connection there, along with many happy startup people. And that was how I got into the world of choral direction and sort of bringing my singing and choral direction together. So that sort of sits here, and it's taken me a while to realize the synergy between my other pieces of work, but there is a very close correlation between them. Even though this music sort of sits here, I have all of my other voice work here, which has many parallels, actually, as I've just spoken to, in the kind of differences between what you need to bring somebody out of themselves to perform in the best way that they can, whether they are just starting out in a kind of community inclusive sense, or whether they are at quite a high sort of elite level already. And that's really where I came to my voice coaching about 6 years, little over 6 years ago. I started doing the voice coaching, predominantly working initially with people in the space of effective communication skills and how we present ourselves, all of that kind of standard stuff. And I realized quite quickly after a couple of years of agency work that for me, what I really wanted to get at the heart of was how we feel when we speak, and how we express ourselves and be compassionate inwardly to ourselves. And I think this speaks very keenly to my experience with the Enneagram, which is something I've had a very deep connection with since, I think, early 2006, actually. So it's sort of 17 years I've had knowledge of that system, and it's crept its way into my life, and I think it is undoubtedly responsible for a lot of the way that I approach things. And it's been very interesting this year to be encouraged through the communities I'm part of to bring that more formally into my work. So that's always underpinned my approach, both musically and with my voice coaching work. So I feel I'm at this quite exciting juncture, and quite vulnerable juncture as well, to bring this into my work. But it is nevertheless exciting to bring something which I so passionately believe in the value of. And to me, it speaks so keenly to this particular topic of this kind of, right thing, wrong thing, these externalities that can feel like they are, so true out there, and actually be so conflicted sometimes with what we're actually feeling inside.
Yeah, I think that conflict is such a pervasive thing, and the need to kind of resolve, and how we resolve and work with that conflict. It's such a difficult thing, and I think there's so much fear of getting it wrong that it's an incredibly difficult thing to really work with. And I think it holds people back from saying anything at all very often, which is a real shame. It's a huge shame. And particularly in my work with people whose perspectives are different and maybe use words differently to most others, it's an incredibly challenging thing when you learn that you're not, the way that you see the world and talk about the world isn't something that's right, that's correct, that's valid. It can take a ton of work to get over. So yeah, I think it's really wonderful, and I really like the idea that different people have different different ways of looking at things, and then bringing the Enneagram into this, bringing an approach that's like, well, actually, there isn't a single one way to do all this. Is so valuable. Do you have before we actually get fully into the assumption, do you have a quote that you'd like to share with us?
Certainly. And you were kind enough to remind me just before we went live, and I had entirely failed to think about this bit. But happily, one that sprung to mind for me was and I'm sure many people know this, that the Marianne Williamson quote, "Our deepest fear," just the opening of that. And this is something which I was first introduced to by my dear mother, who gave me this on a little card and placed this in my room when I was having a particularly challenging time as a teenager. And it's still there, and I see it from time to time when I go back to visit my parents. And for me, it really speaks to that conflict that you mentioned, Matthew, of what is happening internally, and actually how we kind of really cage ourselves sometimes. We really lock ourselves down for fear of that thing out there, and getting it right or not getting it wrong, because those can be two sides of what feels like the same coin, but they feel slightly different. So I'll read that out now. It is many mentions of God in this. So if that is not your thing, I suppose I would say think of the word essence of self or soul, or whatever language works for you in those particular parts. Here it is. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightening about shrinking so that other people won't feel unsure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, it is in everyone. As we let our own light shine, we consciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others.
I think it's such a it talks to the real the way that we give space by by giving ourselves space, we give other people space, which I think is often not what we're thinking in one of these situations. And I do wonder whether actually this search for the right thing to say, it isn't spacious. It doesn't open up possibility. It closes things off, hopefully to a, towards a known safe end. But what is it about that quote that you particularly, that really resonates for you with this particular assumption in mind?
I think, as I was saying to you beforehand, it comes to mind quite often for me. I think it feels like a deep expression of love, both from the author, and it reminds me of my mum a lot in terms of that. And I suppose it speaks to, therefore, the sort of the unsaid stuff that can be so present in silence, and also present when we hold ourselves back. There is this whole wealth of feeling that we carry around inside of us that is often unexpressed. And it doesn't mean all of it needs to be or really should be expressed necessarily. But I recognize very clearly that we cut ourselves off often. We sort of cut ourselves off here. We live in a world culturally whereby the intellectualization of things is revered and held up, and discussion at quite a sort of heady level is sort of is the way that things are done. And to speak from the heart, or even the gut, that kind of instinctual place, can be seen as kind of cavalier, or perhaps just a bit coarse or caustic in those situations, such that people it's easy for people to diminish that stuff, and I think that's it's quite a toxic, sort of pervasive thing which comes into our lives, to the point whereby we are taught really that discourse, proper discourse, is about heady intellectual stuff rather than about how we express our innermost selves, in a way that is true to us, rather than just sort of giving everything. And I think this, for me, speaks also to that thing we were discussing beforehand about the difference between things which are private, those kind of experiences we've had, which are painful, which are wounds which are yet to heal, which we have not worked with, and experiences which are personal, which actually are things that we've metabolized and can be so valuable for other people to hear from, to learn from. And I think it's that part that I'm encouraging of people to speak to, from that personal experiential place, because that stuff is invaluable for other people. And it's so easy for us to think, oh well, everyone knows that. That's it's one of the reasons I love the Enneagram in particular, is because it speaks not to the behavioral things that we all feel. We all feel sad, we all get angry, we all get upset, we all feel depressed at times. But the thing is, these things do not make the person. They are things that are occurrences as a result of context, of experience. But the way that we deal with them internally is so different. And it's so easy for us to think this is what everyone else thinks, and to project our experience of the world onto other people. And just that simple piece of knowledge that actually our view of the world is entirely unique. It can be nothing but unique, even with 8 billion people on the planet, which is extraordinary when you think about it. But it can only be unique, so therefore its validity in being expressed is just as much as anybody else's. So to me, that's what the quote really encapsulates. It's the ease with which we cut ourselves off here and just like dismiss our heart and our gut from what we actually express in the world. And we think it's all just about here upwards. And of course, that speaks to the singing as well. You can't sing well if you're just doing it from here. It's not just about the notes and the words. You've got to connect with the body. That's what makes performances connect with people.
And I think it's a really interesting thing to, think about there's a real conversation side to this. There's something of ourselves we are putting out when we step beyond the kind of purely intellectual. I think partly because we can't work it out ahead of time. When we're like the idea of looking for the right thing to say is partly about like knowing it's a safe thing, knowing it goes in a certain direction. And there's a degree of trust in oneself and in the audience, or the listener, or your conversational partner, that they're going to receive what you say generously and be able to cope with it and be able to take it forward. And that is a vulnerable act, actually. There is a degree of risk involved in this, unavoidably, I think. And maybe this idea of, the right thing to say is about avoiding, is a search to avoid that. But if you do that, you can't ever be surprised. And you're not giving the other person the chance to relate back and to support you. And I really like what you said, particularly about, the validity of perspective, the fact that your perspective is important, because that's one of the things, particularly in my work with neurodivergent people, is the message is your perspective is not valid. It's not important. It's not welcome. And that message is repeated over and over again through much of people's lives. And it's not true. And a lot of the work is actually about, it's a rare perspective is a valuable perspective. Rare things are valuable, and actually the rarity of it is an important part of it. But we learn it's not okay. And I really like, the idea also, the idea that we're experiencing the world differently. We're feeling different, we're noticing different things, we're attending to different things. And part of the reason that it's worth speaking is because we can share some of that with other people. And I think, this idea of finding something that we all agree on already, which I think is probably what we say often when we mean the right thing to say, is prevents us from actually doing that and from exploring.
I think it's a safety thing, as you spoke to that. It's interesting when you think about phrases such as I'm sure we all feel this way, and then people say things, and of course that's about creating safety. It's about a sense of cocooning what we're about to say, and this bubble wrap that says, well, this is valid, and I'm putting this valid container around it, and here's the thing I'm putting into the middle. But the validity is about not being the outlier, not being the person on the other side of the group. And of course, we've all got different little unconscious rationalizing strategies for not feeling on the outside, but they're all so neatly wrapped up in one another, ways of avoiding feeling a particular way, or avoiding something painful, or avoiding feeling that we're being abandoned by other people, by sort of this this strategy that's often happening on a very unconscious level. And I think a lot of that is what happens internally. There's almost a dialogue about saying something or expressing something, which then gets internally subsumed into this rationalization as to, well, it doesn't matter anyway, or, oh, someone else has said it now, or, oh, well, actually the conversation's gone in a different direction. There are so many. I mean, those are mine I'm speaking to. Other people will have different ones, but we'll all have these things which are happening internally, which tell us why it's not valid to speak up, why there's not a reason to say something, or why there might be just one course of action, and agreeing with it, the so-called right thing, or being against the wrong thing, which, as I said earlier, can be what feels like the other side of the coin, but actually can have a slightly more sort of insidious edge to it sometimes, because that's when I think we really avoid speaking up sometimes at those times, and that's where things can sometimes take a darker turn, when we fear for saying the wrong thing. So actually we go along with things that actually probably collectively are not things that we all agree with, but it's that fear that absolutely holds us back. And it just makes me think about the quote again, about that fear of allowing the world to see us in our in our wholeness, in our essence.
And it really makes me think, because I have a feeling into my reaction to that particular phrase is, when I hear that phrase, I expect to be railroaded into something I don't fully agree with. That's the immediate response, honestly, is that someone's going to frame something in a way that I don't fully like. It's going to, and I think that that need, if you're in authority, if you're in whole, like to constrain the conversation, feels like another expression of this, is not only are we looking for the right things to say, but we're trying to keep that dialogue in a place where we're not going to go anywhere really meaningful or unpredictable or scary or all of those things. And actually, I think it's a downright difficult thing to say, well, actually, no, I don't agree. Um, it's yeah, there's something really powerful in there around, like, it's almost like the terms of the conversation. Where are we allowed to to be and not be. And I think there's also like, that's going to be different for everyone. We're all going to have strengths and weaknesses. We're all going to have things that are more emotionally charged for us and things that aren't. And that's a part of being human, and trying to stay away from these things completely. I mean, we don't want to land people with completely overwhelming things, but we also don't want to not talk about them. And it feels like the right thing to say is often a very bland thing.
For me, what comes up there is thinking about the role and the function of compassion, and predominantly self-compassion initially, because without self-compassion, expressing something at all can be very challenging. And then we have the experience of the other person, the experience of the conversation as a whole, which also needs to be compassionate for it to be functional in terms of an expression that does not lead to a negative outcome. And I think that's the thing. It's the idea that disagreement is sort of inherently negative, or that conflict is bad. And these things are framed in quite, I think semantically, these things are framed in quite aggressive sounding terms. Conflict conjures up quite aggressive sort of feeling to it. But if you actually think about, well, what is it to disagree with someone else? Well, actually, if you reframe that as hearing another perspective that's unknown to you, that you don't currently have in your life, and someone else doing the same, yes, you're not agreeing with each other. Is that disagreement? Is that conflict? It's technically, it's not aligned, but to me, that's a hugely different experience. If you have two people or a group of people expressing compassionately their perspective and listening to one another, holistically, really giving space for one another to express that, that is an entirely different experience to people coming at things from this sort of black and white, right, wrong, and which all feels it's about protecting interests, self-interests of some kind, even when we're not necessarily conscious about them. Protecting what we have, our space, our time, our availability, our love, whatever it is, it's about constraining it for fear of losing it. And I think that's when the self-compassion has not really been applied, or just is not there. And again, that feels like that's to me what the quote speaks to, and the necessity for it.
Yes, how we handle what we don't know, and the idea that we should. And I think, when we're talking about, particularly as when we're talking to people who are speaking in some way professionally, there's a degree of authority that comes with that. People are, you're presenting yourself and being presented as someone whose opinion on something matters in some way. And I think it's very easy to get the message that we need to be perfect in that. We need to have we need to completely contain the thing. One of the other things I find, and certainly in my own experience and with other people that I work with, is that need to contextualize and justify, almost preemptively justify everything, so that we can't be accused of, so that someone, and it leads to, like having this huge preamble before you just say what you mean, because you don't feel comfortable doing it before that. And I think that, it's like setting up that situation where we can say what we mean comfortably is sometimes it's necessary as well. That's the other side of it. But I think doing it preemptively is a response to not being in those compassionate places. Assuming that, okay, if we disagree or we don't appear to agree, then we can figure it out and we can see how that works, and we can both move our position and both understand and benefit from each other's perspective, and accept that both of us might have a partial perspective. that we can have a valid but partial perspective.
Mm.
Feels like a lot of, the being compassionate towards oneself, and also that means being able to be open to learning and making mistakes and being corrected, being like, oh, I didn't know that, I had no way of knowing that. Thank you, versus, like, well, no, you must be wrong because I've never heard of that before.
I've long suspected as well that there's probably a correlation between age and experience and this kind of this feeling of a growing need for the big P, the perfection sort of word, coming up if people haven't consciously examined this in themselves. And certainly when I'm working with people who come initially just about public speaking things, there is often such a huge burden that is placed upon themselves in terms of all of the things that they think need to happen, many of which are sort of technical things, or as you say, contextualizing or exemplifying, particular outlying things which might come up that they feel they need to explain a way to start with. And all of that stuff, it's kind of like the heady rationalization I was talking about earlier. It's the stuff that cuts us off at the neck from the body, and really disconnects us from that experiential stuff. So I think quite fundamentally, if we are preparing something to be spoken aloud like that, we're not really doing ourselves any service if we're not checking in with what the body is saying to that. If we're preparing something and we have a feeling of resistance in the body, that's a signal. That's a free signal. We should take some notice of that. It's like the body's going, hello, something's not quite right here. Brilliant. We can use that to examine that compassionately in ourselves. If we're saying something or we're feeling we have to say something, well, what's going on underneath that? What is the reason? What do we disagree with internally? Or is it a fear about something? Is there some way that we can actually bring this in an invitational way, rather than perhaps it's just the way that we're thinking of expressing an idea for fear that somebody will shoot it down? So we sort of mute the whole thing to a level whereby it's really diluted. And then we end up, as you say, with these kind of just safe versions of very small ideas. And I think that there is a tendency for this to happen more and more as hierarchies are in place, because there is fear of change. I think many of us can relate to the fear of change and of being destabilized in ourselves. It's not that we're not interested in it conceptually. It's just the idea. It's the idea of loss, and it's that sort of absence of safety, and the idea of speaking out or going against the flow. All of which again feel quite combative to me in terms of the language that's used there. Putting your foot down. All of this stuff is about stating your opinion, and it feels quite forceful, and it feels like I'm right and other people are therefore necessarily wrong. But I think there's no compassion in that, and that's where that feeling of I need to be, if I'm going to state this rightness, this truth, this perspective, I need to do it in a forceful way, or in a way that's so diluted that nobody could ever disagree with it. And I don't think either of those are effective communication strategies.
I think that idea of like being afraid of disagreement feels so important to this. You've got two strategies essentially to avoid the possibility. You either say something so bland that it's effectively nothing that can be disagreed with, or you state it so strongly that no one could possibly approach that. And neither strategy gives you, neither of them are a conversation. They're a statement. And that feels almost like a missed opportunity, actually. I think when we're thinking about speaking and that feedback that we get, the response that we get, for me, that's a big part of what I get out of speaking. I like the Q&A, but I mainly give a standard talk, that like a talk with a kind of structure to it, just so I can get to the Q&A at the end, because that's the interesting bit for me. But I think a lot of people feel so uncomfortable dealing with that idea, and like the thought of being put on the spot and asked a question that you haven't got a prearranged answer for, is that's a scary thing. And it is a scary thing for a variety of reasons. But I think part of it is, and a big part of it is saying I don't have an answer for that sometimes. Or I don't have an answer for it right now. That's the other thing, is that need to come up with something immediately. Whereas sometimes I just speak out loud and I figure it out as I'm talking, and then I can figure it out with the other person. So I think it's partly that need to have an answer, and partly the need to be like, okay, I know where this is going. Because sometimes, quite a lot of this show, this sentence is me actually not really knowing where this is going to end up. I don't have a point that I'm trying to make. It's more like I'm just kind of, kind of exploring and sharing and trying to get that out there.
I wonder if it feels scary because it's something you can't really prepare for sort of in the head. You can't prepare for intellectually, that thing of Q&A, because that is certainly something that comes up again. Done a lot of work with people over the years about the fear that comes up around answering spontaneous questions. And you can prepare for that. It's just the preparation is not a sort of a revision of things, or that the facts can be useful in an answer, undoubtedly. But if it's about something broadly not factual or something experiential, then the preparation is the physical act of speaking from your experience. That's the practice, rather than the facts and the numbers and the figures that are there. There's something else you touched on earlier that I also really liked, which was talking about the idea of both something stated emphatically, such that people can't disagree, or couched in such a diluted way that people can't really be against it. That both of those are statements. Because I think culturally, it's very easy to see the person that goes, "This is the way it is," as being the one making a statement, being really forceful. But actually the other one, if its intended purpose is also to shut down conversation because nobody can disagree, that is just as much a statement as the other, and neither is effective because they don't invite discourse and they don't allow the possibility of, whatever we want to call it, disagreement, conflict, or discussion.
Yeah, I think discourse is the word, or dialogue, perhaps. I just want to say we seem to have lost your camera feed. I don't know if there is. Can still hear you fine, which is good, and is the most important thing. But for some reason, we seem to have lost your camera. So
let me. Has that
that's better.
Now?
Thank you. Yes, you're back.
I have no idea what happened. It
very strange.
It just deselected itself for some reason. So my apologies.
Great. Well, thank you for that.
Nothing exciting was happening. I was just talking in the background. Yes. I wish I could report otherwise.
But yeah, no, I completely. I feel like this. I really like what you talk. And I find interestingly, I prepare for talks by planning a whole load of stuff that I don't use. And that's not, and I used to be like, what am I doing? But actually, that preparation gives me clarity. It gives me an understanding. It gives me the words. It's not that I have to use exactly that. And I think that idea of preparation is a really interesting one, when we like finding precisely the right words, but we can support ourselves sometimes. And I think having specifics to hand, like knowing that they exist, knowing roughly what they are, that can be really helpful in certain contexts. But it's about finding out when they're useful and using them then, and having them at your fingertips, rather than knowing exactly which one to use when.
Yes, it's not a quantity of information committed to memory. That's never something I've heard people comment on, how impressed they were. How many facts you fitted into that speech? It's
Yeah.
not a piece of feedback I've ever heard from anyone. But
I really liked how you basically, your speech was pretty much like the Wikipedia page. That was, yeah.
Yeah, quite. I mean, that's a challenge, to make reading something like that actually sound exciting. I mean, it can be done, but you have to work at that. You have to work in a real bodily way to get something which on paper does not have a lot of, vim and vigor to it. But
I think
I was just thinking it is very interesting though on the sort of recollection of facts and figures, because absolutely having those to hand is so valuable. But it is much more about, as you say, which ones to use in that precise moment. And actually, there are so many examples in the world of speakers who have sort of entirely gone off track, but still been utterly captivating due to their connection with themselves and therefore to the audience. And they're not necessarily the people that are providing all of the information. They may be captivating in an entirely different way.
Yeah, it feels like there's something around the context in which the information is significant. You're providing a story, a way of us understanding, relating to something abstract that is difficult to contextualize. And that's actually often the value. And that comes back for me to the perspective thing. Is how am I making sense of this situation? And part of it is, how am I making sense of the context right now, the interpersonal situation? Because that, and looking for a kind of abstract correct thing takes us out of that context. And I'm not sure we can ever, the idea of, even if I'm not sure, I don't think it's necessarily, it's not even desirable, but it certainly isn't possible whether or not it's desirable. So you kind of have to work with it, whether you like it or not, I think. And that feels like a real kind of, a significant aspect of this. We need to allow ourselves that we're operating in a specific context, a specific milieu, each time, and that each time that's different. Even if, we are different people, we show up as different people, other people show up as different people, and trying to find that perfect, single, repeatable message that works. I don't think it's possible. I mean, maybe I don't know whether you feel differently, or but it feels like we've got to be sensitive to the situation that we're in, and that felt sense is a big part of how we can do that.
Oh, absolutely. And for want of a better word, kind of training that sense by seeing the value in our feelings and emotions, because I think this takes me back thinking about the culturally kind of cutting ourselves off at the neck, really, because I think there is a lot of that stuff which can feel devalued as, people being overly emotional or hysterical, or all these kind of words which have quite a negative connotation, particularly when we think about things in a professional context, which are to do with expressing unprocessed emotion, that kind of the difference between private versus personal. And of course, when we express that kind of, untapped, unworked through emotion, it's more likely other people will become reactive, and things can become inflamed very quickly. But that is through a sense of not having the awareness about what's going on underneath. I think in those situations where I've seen that happen, and conversations break down like that, it's because the feeling, whatever it is internally that somebody's had, has become so big that even though they've cut it off here, it's exploded out of their mouth eventually, because it's overwhelming bodily. And of course, then by the time that's happened, it's not actually really, it would take somebody very grounded in themselves on the other end of that to really hear the essence of that. So I think, we owe it to ourselves to feel into that situational context that you're speaking of, in order to allow ourselves to be heard to the very best of our ability, in order to be seen in our wholeness, showing up and actually being compassionate to ourselves and allowing us to express the things that come up, and trusting in as much as we can that other people will allow the space for that and will also be invested because it benefits them too in that process.
Yeah, and I think for me, part of my experience is actually realizing, well, if a space where if I do that and as a result I'm not welcome in that space, then I wasn't welcome in that space. It's not my fault. I think that's the other side of it, is actually, if I've spoken sincerely and compassionately and kindly, and that wasn't welcome. I think in the past I'd have said, well, I failed to say the right thing. Whereas this conversation is making me think, well, actually, maybe it's not on me always to, there's a responsibility on both sides to hear and to speak. And I think that's, finding oneself in a context where that isn't okay and I think hiding those things is another reason why we might seek the right thing. It's like, if I can avoid moving into a space where I have strong emotional resonance, that might be a good reason, and knowing that is unsafe sometimes, and perhaps knowing that's unsafe in a space, but rather than blaming myself for struggling with it, thinking about what it is about the space that means I can't express myself. And this is one of the things for me, my work is informed by my own experiences, some of them really negative. And there are some things I have very strong feelings about in a professional space. And I think it's actually a very interesting question around this whole idea of professionalism, detached professionalism. It challenges some of this stuff, is actually connecting with that and being able to express it in a way that doesn't make it just about me, but still has that energy. And I really like what you say about, if we have is we use it in the moment. Otherwise, if we try and keep a lid on it and bottle it up, then it comes out inappropriately. Whereas if we can tap into it and use it, it can kind of direct us and guide us. But if we don't use that, then it's got to come out somewhere, and that won't be, it won't have got to do its job. So it will come out at the right, it won't be the right time for it. It'll be too much, or yeah.
It's all energy, isn't it? It has to go somewhere. We can't continue to contain all of this emotional energy, and I completely agree. I mean, you see it coming out in things that are passive aggressive, or acts of sabotage or self-sabotage, even at times, in a professional context, or acts of refusing communication, certainly just not telling somebody something crucial in a moment, withholding, and all of these things. And this really speaks to the motivation. The action out there is containing, but what's motivating it underneath is what's important to understand about one another. And I think it's very interesting to think about what does a sort of modern workplace look like in that sense. I mean, we've all got much more used to the idea of the hybrid office and of working remotely and using online tools like this. But actually, I still think we've got a long way to go in terms of actually the expectation of and the allowing of compassionate discourse like this, and seeing it as, to me, one of, if not the most valuable and essential part of enabling a team to function, effectively. Because if we don't understand one another, if we don't appreciate one another, and this is an act of doing that, listening to one another and expressing in this way, then these things will boil over internally, and we might not all see them, but there will be consequences. There will be things that happen in the background or things that don't happen as a result of this unresolved emotional trauma. Is a big word, but it is on a low level. That is essentially what's happening. It's unresolved feelings and emotions which are not being channeled into expression. And the act of expressing them, the act of speaking them aloud, develops that skill. It develops that muscle of being able to speak from experience to the point whereby it can become instinctual, so that we're not doing it reactively anymore, but we're actually doing it to express something which will benefit potentially the entire group or organization. And that's why I think it's so important.
I think that that point about it being a part of the skills of a team. If you don't have this, if you have everyone who sees basically the same thing, why have a team? You could just do with one person. If you have a bunch of people who have a diverse variety of perspectives but can't share them, you don't have the value of being in a team, because you don't value other people. You don't. So it is all about being able to make that connection. And I think, for me, one of there feels like an interesting corollary here in communication, that, this idea of the golden rule, do unto others, and the replacement with the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would wish to be done by. And I think there's a real aspect of communication that falls in, this understanding we are experiencing the world differently. We are seeing different things. We are, and we are seeking to communicate in ways that are at the intersection of our perception, but with big and the difference is part of the value. We don't need to find things that are blandly in common. We want to be exploring the edges of this. It's valuable, and it's valuable to share this with others in the right context. And I love what you said about practice, developing this. It's something you develop over time. I think it's one of the things about showing up and doing this show for so long, is it's definitely changed how I do this stuff in general, just through practice. And it doesn't have to be huge and big either. I think this is the other, people think about this overwhelming thing, and it's doing it in small steps, ways that feel fun and interesting and playful, being able to play with it and make mistakes. You've got to be in a space where you can make mistakes. If you're not, then you're never going to it's not safe to do this. You have to go to finding the right thing and doing it. You can't develop this capacity if it's not okay to say the wrong thing sometimes. So yeah, I really I think, but particularly, and I think this, whatever lens we use, and in your case, I think the Enneagram as an approach to this, to understanding how maybe different people are experiencing things. And my lens is primarily neurodiversity, and understanding that different people are seeing different things, experiencing different things, have different ways of talking about the same thing, and that's a positive.
Absolutely.
Rather than a problem.
Beautifully put.
Thank you. So if people want to get in touch with you, we've got your website and your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. So would you like people to would you like people to connect with you, follow you on LinkedIn? How would you like
that would be lovely if we're not already connected. If people watching would like to connect with me, I'm always happy to connect with new people, and I'm a big fan of getting to know people over sort of coffee chats when I've got time to do that. That would be lovely to hear from some people.
And obviously also you've got the choir work. So is there anything that people can, maybe they could come along, or any of your work, or
Well,
how
that
would
would
they
be
find
lovely.
that aspect of your work?
There was a concert I had back in February with my UCL choir in London, just down in Waterloo, where a couple of Happy Startup people came along, which was so lovely to have some familiar faces in the audience. So yes, I think if anyone gets in touch with me, I need to get better, I think, at telling people about concerts, but it's edging in, sort of step-by-step thing. But it's always lovely to have familiar faces in the audience. And I think it's a different side to the work that I do, which can feel very interesting for people to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting how when we have these things that are complementary but not necessarily obviously and officially so,
Mhm.
that in our practice it's a nice
Yeah,
thing it's a different way to understand and connect. And I think also that how much of singing together is a way of developing these kind of skills as well, you
absolutely.
know
Yeah.
in a more playful way.
Mm.
um, so yeah, no, I think it's wonderful. And also, have you got anything new that you're planning? I think you mentioned bringing more of the Enneagram into your work.
Yeah, so it's been such a generous thing to me over my last sort of 17 years, and it's also been generously received by people in communities such as Happy Startup and Better Bolder Braver in the last sort of year and a half. So it's with a lot of encouragement from those communities to bring this stuff into my work. And I think what it is to me is essentially the missing piece of the puzzle, because all of my work has been about showing oneself, really speaking aloud, recording people on video, getting people to feel comfortable in this environment. And all of the work that I do about voice coaching is to do with that, with presenting ourselves and capturing ourselves in a way that feels authentically like us. And I realized this piece I was doing behind the scenes was really about this big piece of knowing yourself. And this is I suppose a deliberate act of bringing that more formally into my work. So I'm bringing in the typing interviews, which is a sort of first entry into the Enneagram, uh, starting point that really enables people to start on the journey with that. And I'm also going to be starting a regular discussion group, kind of facilitated space, just to get practical, sort of the practical benefits of the Enneagram, which I think are innumerate. Really, there are so many different ways in which we can practically benefit from hearing one another and hearing one another's experience of the world. So actually, in a way, it's speaking very much to what we've just been talking about, a facilitated space where people will have space to express their experience of something, and for others to go, that's so weird, but I love hearing about this entirely different experience that you have. That's bonkers to me, but I love it. And I think it's so special, and it's so moving as
Mm.
well, for people to both be heard in that space and to hear one another. And yeah, it feels like it really just so satisfactorily and emotionally underpins that work of showing ourselves to do the knowing ourselves bit that goes underneath that.
Mm. Wonderful, thank you. And yeah, I think it's so valuable in doing this work to be in spaces where, again, that playfulness,
Mm,
where you can be with other people who are exploring and getting it, and develop the skills in a safe enough environment,
mm, mm,
a place where you can make mistakes.
mm.
So yeah, I love that, and having a lens, some tools to understand that, and to play with those as well, and to understand them and how you can use them is wonderful.
Yeah,
So yeah, thank you.
yeah. Thank you,
Super.
Matthew.
So yeah, and if people want to find that, I take it they can find that through your website as well. Is that
That's not
or what's the
currently on
web?
the website, but yes, that's definitely an
That's where it will
in-action
be.
piece. Yes, I
Cool.
mean, my email is kieran@jointhedialogue.com, so people can find me there, or on LinkedIn if they'd like to find out more about that. But I will be more actively putting that out there in the world. Yes, and that's a piece of
Fab.
accountability, an important piece of public accountability on that front.
Fab. Well, perhaps by the time the podcast episode goes out, because those are on a little bit of a delay, hopefully that'll be available there. So if you're listening on that, then do check it out immediately. But otherwise, follow Kieran in the meantime if you're interested. I think it's well, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I think it's such an important topic and something people have so much shame and discomfort around. And so I thank you for doing the work and for sharing this with us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you about it and have such an open conversation. And really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me, and thank you all for watching and for your comments. And we've actually got some thanks in the comments as well from Anya. So thank you. Thank you all for watching. It really is you in the audience that makes this possible. Or legitimizes my excuse to talk to interesting people doing wonderful things. Please do share it with someone who you think would value it. Rate it, review it, mention it, however you feel engaging with it, because that helps other people find it who might benefit from it too. And it helps me understand what really matters to you as well in the audience, which is really helpful. Again, it's a dialogue, it's a conversation. So you can find upcoming and past episodes of the show on YouTube and LinkedIn, and the podcast is available if you search for Delightful Dissent on your favorite podcast platform. If we're not on your favorite podcast platform, let me know too, and we'll see if we can get on there. So we're getting more and more episodes up through the backlog on the podcast, and we'll be relaunching the website properly very soon, so keep an eye out for that. And we're also still finalizing the next couple of guests. We've had a little bit of a one of the problems with this show is sometimes things are planned very close by, sometimes things are planned a long way out, and both of those seem to cause difficulties sometimes. So so do keep an eye out. Well, I hopefully will have another episode in a couple of weeks, but I'm not 100% sure yet, and we haven't quite nailed that down. But we will be carrying on. So keep an eye out, and if you're interested in being on the show, also do reach out and let me know. So I hope to see you all very soon at the next Delightful Dissent episode. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks and goodbye.